Good morning, guys. Back here in the office on a little series I'm starting to call Man, I Wish I Could Go Outside. But I actually did try to go out a little bit earlier, but Alaska's under a winter weather advisory right now, and the roads are awful. We've been getting snow for the past like 48 hours. It's snowing right now right outside the window, and the issue is we're right around freezing, so the roads keep thawing and then refreezing, and it's just causing the sheet of ice to build up. And rather than push it, I just figured I'd come home. So I made a little cup of coffee and I jumped on Lightroom and I started going through my catalogs, some of my old wildlife images, and it started me down a rabbit trail on some tips and tricks that I've learned over the last few years doing wildlife photography that have nothing to do with gear, because gear is just beat to death, and I didn't want to do another gear video. So these 10 tips and tricks have nothing to do with gear. So hopefully we can learn something together. And if you guys know any that maybe I don't list, throw them down in the comments, because I'm always looking to improve. I'm definitely by no means the best wildlife photographer, but I'm learning. So hopefully I can share some of the things that I've learned, and we can both take something away. So first and foremost, you got to learn your subject. You have to learn everything you can about the animal before you go out and try to photograph it, to give yourself the best opportunity of catching that animal in the environment, doing the behavior, doing everything that you want to capture in the wildlife image. So like first and foremost, habitat. Where is this animal at? Is it a shorebird? Is it a moose? What time of the year is it? Where do the moose hang out at different times of the year? Is it a fox? Is it denning season? Is it out sleeping under like a random tree at night? These are all things that you can do research on. You can read a book, you could Google it, and you can learn about that animal way before you go out and try to photograph it, which will always present you more opportunities to get the shot you want. You can also look at the food sources, like for caribou, for instance, like they eat something completely different over the winter when there's not a lot of vegetation available. They go to the lichen fields and they eat all the lichen on the tundra. So knowing where that stuff grows throughout the winter has led me to be able to find where these caribou overwinter at. So another little tip, try to find their food source. Also, what goes into that is the migration. Obviously, I'll just jump back to caribou. Caribou do not spend much time in a single spot at all throughout the year. They overwinter in a general area, and then they migrate back to the calving grounds up to the northeast of Alaska. But knowing when they migrate has really helped me catch that behavior, catch that animal moving down into my location. So just tracking that, I actually found it online. So keep track of migrations. I know birds have a lot to do with migrations. Like up here, we have something called Kramer's Field. It's a wildlife refuge specifically for these waterfowl and these birds that migrate, from the lower 48, Florida, all the way up to Alaska, and they kind of congregate at that area. So just knowing where they're going to be heading is a really important tip. And then finally, like for instance, when do they mate? I know a lot of the photographers like to catch, moose in the rut, elk in the rut, things like that. I had to learn, and I never knew this. I learned this from a pretty prolific moose naturalist up here about their mating season. So everybody always attributes the moose mating season to the weather. They always think that like, hey, when we have our first cold snap, or like we get the termination dust, which is just like the first snowing of the year, moose start to rut, right? And like late September, early October. It actually has nothing to do with the weather. Believe it or not, it's completely based off of hours and minutes of sunlight throughout the day. So every single year on the exact same day in the exact same location, the sun on its axis gives you the same amount of daylight, and that's when the moose know, hey, boom, it's time to start the rut. So every year you can actually get closer and closer to locking down the exact day where the moose are going to start running. And for me, I'm obviously not going to push out the exact date where I'm at, but it's actually fairly later in the year than in other places. Where I'm at, it's actually well into October that I've seen the moose start to rut in my experience. So just knowing little things like that, it has nothing to do with weather, it has to do with days of sunlight. Those are all key tips that'll help you learn more about the subject you're trying to photograph. Let's jump into tip number 2. For tip 2, composition. I know this one's also kind of beat to death, but let's think about it a little different when we talk about it. So a lot of the things I used to do and a lot of things that I see is clipping of body parts on animals. Whether that's, antlers or hooves or the back half, clipping parts of the animal, whether or not you realize it, it kind of minimizes the power of the animal. It's kind of strange. So what I like to do is when I'm photographing an animal, like even in deep snow where you can't even see the bottom of the hooves, I always try to leave that negative space down there for the viewer to almost imagine where the rest of the animal would be. So I've learned that just giving the animal room in the frame really helps keep the animal feeling powerful in the frame. So try not to clip body parts. Depending on if your animal's moving through your frame, you always try to leave room for your animal to look into the frame. You don't want to, like, let's say the animal's moving left to right. You don't want to position that animal on the right side of the frame with negative space behind it and nothing for the animal to look into. So that's important when you're doing like environmental portraits and you want to show a little bit more of the habitat in the actual frame. Make sure you're giving your animal or your subject room to look into. Talk about the rule of thirds. There's different kinds of rules of thirds, and there's different positions you can put the animal in for rules of thirds. And it's not always like a hard fact science. You know, sometimes it looks really awesome if you center punch an animal, you know, like center focus, dead smack dab portrait of the animal right in front, looks awesome. But start playing with it. Start using that rule of thirds, moving your focus point around and positioning the animal in different areas. Kind of try to do something different. You know, how many portraits of animals do we see? We see, or at least I see a lot, and I've taken a lot. I'm trying to get to the point now where I'm using the rule of thirds and positioning the animal in different aspects of the rule of thirds to kind of give it a little bit something different that we don't see so much. What else do we have here? Oh, big one, huge one actually. Pay attention to the background. You know, you're not always going to be out there shooting with a 2.8 or an f4. You know, sometimes you're going to have to stop down, whether that's light dependent or you're trying to get the full animal in focus. You got to pay attention to what is behind the animal. It can drastically change the overall image. So if you stop down a couple stops, let's say you're at like 5, 6, even all the way up to like 7.1 or 8, you're going to start getting more and more of that background in focus. And if you're just snapping away at the subject, not paying attention to what's directly behind it, you can actually ruin the image. And I've done it so many times with like even things like a traffic cone. Like I'll be photographing a fox, and right behind the fox, unbeknownst to me, is a traffic cone. And I'm sitting there like, oh, these images are awesome. These are gonna be awesome. I can't wait to take them home. Throw them up on the computer, and I'm like, there's a dang orange traffic cone in the background of every single one of these images, and it just pulls me right out of it. And you know, I don't want to clone them out and do all that happiness. So most of the time, the images they're almost garbage to me. So positioning the animal, like let's say it's a white chickadee, like I was shooting the other day. I was trying to position the animal against a dark background to make them pop, or vice versa. If you have a dark moose on white background with snow, it's just going to help the animal pop off the frame. Now, granted, you can get into exposure and things like that. That'll give you a little bit of a headache, but overall, the tip before I dive too down into this, you guys know I like to ramble, is paying attention to the background. And I have a little mantra. I literally just say background, background, background in my head over and over as I'm shooting the animal, so I'm consciously paying attention to it. And then finally, under composition, simplicity. Sometimes you don't have to, like I said, follow the rule of thirds. You don't have to do anything in particular. You know, what's the old adage? I forget who said it, but it's, you know, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And that's really what I'm talking about with simplicity is key. Sometimes focusing in on abstract parts of the animal and doing the fine art kind of thing is beautiful. Like you can punch in on a specific detail of an animal that you would never really think to photograph, and you wind up, you know, loving it. It's kind of abstract, it's kind of different, and it's just something to keep in mind, just keeping it simple. All right, moving on to tip number 3. You got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. So I can't tell you how many times, you know, I've been out in -30, -40, you know, the wind howling, and I'm like, man, what are you doing? You could just be at home, you know, watching TV, reading a book, doing anything else than what you're doing right now. But those images are always the best. I feel like, you know, when I'm uncomfortable, there's a story, and I get an image, that story is burned into that image. So when I see that image, I immediately think about, man, there was like 20 knot winds, it was -10 that day, the wind chill was awful, and I find myself loving that image so much more. And it may not be an image that everybody really likes, like a technically good image, but it's something that I connect with. And, you know, first and foremost, you got to love what you're doing. But I just wanted to remind everybody, it's okay to be uncomfortable when you're out there laying in the snow for 4 to 6 hours, or it's raining, or, you know, you could be doing anything else. Keep in mind, being uncomfortable is good, and it's something you can get comfortable doing, and then you'll find yourself not being phased like water on a duck's back. Tip number 4, and I know, sorry, hang on. Tip number 4, you got to get low. Rule of thumb for me is I always try to be below my subject's eye line. And sometimes that's really hard. For instance, if I'm shooting a beaver in the water, or if I'm shooting a fox or caribou or whatever it may be, getting below the eye line of that animal gives so much more grandeur to your subject. It makes them just so much more powerful within the frame. You know, nothing's worse than shooting down on an animal. It minimizes that animal. And the easiest way to see what I'm talking about is if you have a cat or a dog or any pet around the house, take a picture from your perspective, from your eye level, and then lay on the floor and take a picture of that same animal and see how different that composition is. See how different that animal feels in the frame. And it's the same thing with wildlife photography. Get low, get almost, you know, on the ground sometimes if it's a tiny animal, and really kind of give that animal the respect in the frame that it deserves. Tip 5 is patience. I learned when I was young, if you're lonely when you're alone, you're probably in bad company. So if you get out there and you find yourself, you know, being bored and lonely and I don't know what I'm doing, wildlife photography is probably not for you. You gotta be out there for hours and hours on end, most of the time with nothing showing up. You know, everybody sees these images that we take and it's like, oh man, I wish I could go out and find a bison every time I go look. Like, yeah, that would be phenomenal. But most of the time you go out there and you actually don't see much. And that's okay. You just you got to learn to just enjoy being in nature. Just the act of being out there, sitting in nature, appreciating the sounds around you are going to just lead you to be a better wildlife photographer. What I do sometimes to combat that, because don't get me wrong, I get really, really bored, is the journal that I talked about in my camera bag video. Journal the things you're seeing around you. You know, what's the weather like? What are the sounds you're hearing? Can you identify the birds? Can you draw a picture of some of the grass and the leaves and the trees around you? And all that does is it gives you more time out in nature, and it kind of occupies your brain. 6, scouting. Scouting is huge. I do more scouting than I do photography, and that's probably just because I enjoy being out in the wilderness in general, and I don't always want to bring all the gear. So I actually, yesterday when I was out scouting, I found a crossfox den. Now, a crossfox is a variant of the red fox, and it's been something I've been looking for since about 2 months ago, when I realized that these fox, it was time of the year for them to go start denning up. And I actually finally found one yesterday, and I'm so excited about it because I've been looking for one for, like I said, 2 months. They're darker. They have dark faces. They're not that bright, vibrant red for most red foxes, and they're really awesome. Other than that, other than the little variant in the coat, they're the same species. They're just they're a little bit more rare, and I think they're beautiful. So being out scouting using trail cameras, like I did in the last video, has led me to realize that, you know, hey, if I set a couple of these up, I can really hone in on where these animals are. And I went out, and and another little variant to this is learning the tracks. You know, learning to identify what you're seeing on the ground. So like I went out and I actually bought a little Alaska track book. It's like a little paper flip book, and I got it at the local library or Barnes and Noble store, and it was like I think it was like $4.99. It was super cheap, but it's allowed me to be like, okay, take a quick picture on my smartphone, take it home, and compare and find out what it is. Like, hey, that's a dog. Hey, that's a fox. It's caribou. That's a moose. You know, and it's really allowed me to get better. But I just wanted to tie that all into scouting. Scouting's a huge part. It's no different than anything else you would do. Like if you were hunting, that's essentially what you're doing. Is you're hunting with a camera. So you want to get out there and scout the areas. Number 7 is incredibly important. You got to look for good light. You know, the subject could be really not that interesting, but if there's really good light behind that subject or around that subject, instantly you got yourself like a top class image. So if you're sitting at home and you see the light start to pop, or it starts to be a beautiful sunset with like a pink sky, get out and try to find anything, whether it's like a backyard songbird or a ground squirrel or anything that you can see. As long as there's really good light, you're going to make a phenomenal image. So I always say, chase good light and chase bad weather. So there's a lot of drama in bad weather, whether that's, sideways rain or snowfall or heavy winds blowing the fur or the feathers on these animals. That acts for like a lot of drama in the frame. So along with good light, you want bad weather. At least that's what I've realized that I like in my images. Number 8, put the animals before your pictures. And what I mean by that is you got to be respectful. Nothing's worse than going out there into an animal's home, nonetheless, kicking in their front door and ruining their whole day. Imagine, if someone did that to you. So Just go out there, put the animal's welfare in front of the picture you're trying to get out of it, and just be respectful. The best pictures actually come from the animal when it's relaxed. Like for a moose example, when their ears pin back and their hackles stand up, that's not a good image. You can tell that the moose is distressed in the image, and it's not what I'm looking to capture. I want the animal to be relaxed, and I want it to just be looking at me and oblivious that I'm there even. So be respectful, put the animal's welfare in front of your photography, and you're going to find yourself taking better pictures. Number 9 is a quote from Robert Capa that I also repeat to myself very often. If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. And I've seen that so many times. And it's not even a resolution thing as much as it is just filling the frame. If you have like a beautiful subject, and sometimes it works. Don't get me wrong. If there's a nice landscape behind it or a mountain range, tiny animal, big frame, sometimes that works really well and they're beautiful images. But for the most part, with wildlife photography, bird photography, and anything like that in general, is the details in the animal are what are so beautiful, and that's what I'm chasing. That's what most of the people doing wildlife photography are chasing, is the details in the animal. So just fill the frame, get a little bit closer, never at the expense of your safety, but it's going to lead to better images overall. Number 10, behavior, and behavior. Catching the animal doing something rather than just walking is going to lead to so much more of a powerful image. You're giving the animal personality almost by chasing that behavior and getting images of their day-to-day life. I love to catch animals feeding. I love to catch them during the rut, showing that behavior, and it overall leads to just better wildlife images. And a little bonus tip, number 11, tell a story. If you can tell a story with your image, it's going to captivate the reader. And by the reader, I mean the looker or the viewer. But what I mean by that is, don't just take 1 or 2 images of the same thing. Try to tell the entire story, whether that be capturing the environment, capturing the food source, capturing the weather that day, capturing the overall location, and then tying that into like a series or a set of 5 to 10 images makes the whole experience so much more powerful, even for the viewer. Whether it's not just you telling the story, but the viewer who's soaking that all in is going to get so much more out of it if you can get 5 to 10 images even of the whole story. And that's really all I have today. I really just wanted to do something quick, share 10 wildlife photography tips that have nothing to do with gear, and hopefully you learned something. Hopefully it maybe re-sparked a memory. Maybe you already learned it and it just brought it back up for you. But I hope you guys are still doing well. Once this weather advisory starts to clear, I'm going to get back out there. Like I said, I found that den, so hopefully we can spend some time there together. I look forward to seeing you guys again in the future, and take care of each other out there. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.